Hi, this is Doug May, and this is the second video or second chapter or video series on electricity in Quebec. The first chapter dealt with the production of electricity in Quebec, what was available to the residents of Quebec, and how much did they actually need, and where did the electricity come from, both from their own production and from the amount of imports. We'll recall that most of the imports came from Newfoundland and Labrador, but most recently, imports have increased from the United States. And the reason for that was the drought around the James Bay area of Quebec. So today what we want to do is focus on prices, not production, and we're going to see, we want to try to answer a couple of questions. One, how are the prices for Quebec households and for Quebec businesses, how are they determined, and why are they so cheap? In this first part 2A, we're going to look at, what's Quebec's contribution to answering these two questions? Okay, so let's get started. So our primary question, which we want to ask ourselves, for households, what is the current price per kilowatt hour to the average household in Montreal? And that gives us another question to follow. So let's look at that. So in Montreal, they just introduced some new rates around April, I think, of this year. So it's 6.678 cents per kilowatt hour up to the first 1,200 kilowatt hours per month, and then it's 10.153 cents above that using this DP rate. Plus there's a monthly charge, okay? Now, if you assume that the average household in Quebec, which I'm told is the average amount of kilowatt hours used per month, is about 1,550, then that comes out to about $8.30 per kilowatt hour. And then I looked at the electricity charges at my townhouse in St. John's, but I then assumed that the amount of usage was the very same as in Montreal, so that comes out to 15.022 cents per kilowatt hour when you take the basic charge into it. So the actual kilowatt hour is slightly less, but then you've got the basic charge. So it comes out to 15.022 cents. You have to ask yourself, why the difference? I mean, how can they be so much cheaper than we are? The other thing to note is that under the new agreement with Hydro-Quebec and the Quebec government is that prices can increase up to 3% annually over the next 5 years, and there has to be a review. HQ is promoting dynamic pricing. So what's dynamic pricing? But dynamic pricing is where the price can vary even over the day. So if you have dynamic pricing during the day, you'll try to use electricity in your house off peak hours, which are generally the morning when you're having breakfast, or at night when you're having supper, right? So, but it can vary over the year too. So we expect, for instance, the price of Airbnbs in St. John's to go up during the summer when there's a high demand. In the same way, if you're flying to St. John's from out of province or out of the country into St. John's for Christmas, then you won't be surprised if airline tickets are a little bit more expensive. The really cheap fares come not quite so much in the summer or around Christmas time. So that's dynamic pricing. And so we congratulate some of the ad agencies, I guess, in Montreal for coming up with this dynamic concept of dynamic pricing. How does the price, their 8.30 cents, compare to elsewhere? This is a diagram I took from an annual report, 2024, from Hydro-Quebec. They assume that Montreal is at 100, St. John's this is for 2024, and I just put in, rejigged it for 2025 for what I knew were the prices. So if you compare the two prices in the previous slide, you're going to come up to it's about 100. So we're 80% more expensive. What about Winnipeg? 31. Toronto is 187. So they're a little bit in 2024. But I've got family in Boston. They're way above, right? You don't want to live in San Francisco. The bottom line here is that the prices for electricity in Quebec and in Montreal are the cheapest in Canada, and they're the cheapest in the G7. So that's part of their industrial strategy, cheap prices, okay? How are they able to do this? Well, first of all, you've got to say Hydro-Quebec is a government-owned corporation. What it's trying to do is, the important part here, it is a cost minimizer, right? It's a regulated monopolist. So it's the only supplier. But again, instead of having a set price, when they go to industrial customers, then the prices can vary depending upon the size of the customer and when they can use electricity and all that sort of thing. For consumers, we saw that they've introduced this quote-unquote dynamic pricing, but they also remember that why are they a public corporation? Because they are providing an essential good, that is electricity, to households who actually who need it. The other thing here is that any profit which is owned by a crown corporation or by a public corporation in a province, it would be considered revenue to the province and therefore would affect equalization payments under the Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act. Well, there were articles written by Quebec economists back in the late 90s which said that it was Quebec's advantage that the way they could increase their substantial equalization payments from the federal government was to, quote unquote, dissipate the rents, keep the prices as low as possible, don't make a profit. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. What about electricity generation in Quebec really gets us back to where we were before? The important point here is this one, that over 90% of the power generated within comes from hydro stations. Now, as we saw before, that's decreasing because, once again, of this drought, which is continuing into this year, 2025, it's going down. Still above 9%, but wind power is, as we saw in the previous video, plays a much larger role. Okay, so probably one of the biggest hydro generating stations in Quebec is called the Robert Bourassa generating station on the Grande Riviere. It used to be called LG2 for La Grande. And it's got a capacity which is slightly higher than the capacity at Churchill Falls. Now, the other thing we should point out, and Wade Locke, for instance, points out in his assessment piece, which was on LinkedIn, is that you don't run at full capacity. You generally run it. You need the full capacity during, or you may have to get there during the coldest months of the year, but you don't need it all the time. So over the year, Churchill Falls typically runs at 72% capacity. What does Robert Bourassa run at? Well, just run at full capacity. I think it's around 29,600 megawatts. So it's less than Churchill Falls, right? You always have to keep in the back of your mind that the reservoir, whether it's the Robert Bourassa Reservoir or it's a Smallwood Reservoir at Churchill Falls, those reservoirs are thought of by those in the industry as huge storage baths. Point here is the average cost of electricity ranges from station to station, and in addition, there are transmission costs. An interesting part here, which it brings up, is that Hydro-Quebec has captured, maybe holding hostage, as some would say, CFLCO, which is the company which owns and operates Churchill Falls, but Hydro-Quebec owns 34.2% of it. When you're looking at prices which are often discussed in the media that CFLCO gets, you have to always keep in mind that to the way Hydro-Quebec looks at it wouldn't be what CFLCO gets. It was the effective price that it has to pay. So to at least to this extent, 34.2%, it's paying itself. Here's the Robert Bourassa. Then there's another one quite close to it. Well, usually it's the same dam, actually. It is La Grande LG2A, and there's LG3, LG1. There are a lot of dams along the La Grande, and it's in this area that the drought is occurring. Obviously, it's not occurring over here. But to get the power, you've got to have a transmission line. So at one time, the transmission lines from Churchill Falls, they hoped they could get a transmission line through Quebec, they being Joey Smallwood did, but the Quebec government wouldn't allow it. Smallwood could have forced it under the British North America Act, but Ottawa discouraged him from doing that. So then I'm going to say there's a distribution site I'm thinking more of Newfoundland, Labrador, Hydro, where you'd have a distribution site which would turn over to, in the St. John's area, to the Fortis-owned company, Newfoundland Power, right? So you've got to think of these costs. There are sort of the costs in the neighborhood, what I'll call the actual putting the poles on your property or the underground lines to your house. Then there are the distribution points. There's a big transmission line. So for folks in St. John's, you can think of coming in from Muskrat Falls, the distribution site at Soldiers Pond. Right? How is Hydro-Quebec? I was able to say that the prices to the households are the lowest in Canada, the G7, which we mentioned earlier. And Hydro-Quebec's answer to that is the fact that they use hydropower. And not only do they use hydropower, but it's cheap green energy. It's cheap green energy, as a matter of fact, if you forget about the fact that that's once it's being actually produced. The cement in the dam isn't so environmentally friendly. So the question then becomes, how are we going to determine the price at the generating gate? And here we get into a little bit of economics. I'm going to potentially bore you, if not confuse you, but economics students should understand this, at least those who have studied microeconomics. So we're going to minimize the economic costs. And the economic costs are different from the accounting costs because of the fact that economists, when they're thinking of costs, include a rate of return on capital as being included in the capital prices, right? So this is a production function where the amount of output, Q, is some function, that's what this little f is, of the amount of capital stock, labor, energy, purchase energy, that wouldn't be much in this case, purchase materials, purchase supplies, I suppose, phone services, that sort of thing, and W. But the thing which really makes hydro viable, the key here is to having lots of W, water, available to you. So it's not the typical manufacturing, what economists would call the CLEMS, production function. We've got a CLEMS with a W in here. It's actually not the labor which enters into the production process. We're not actually using up workers. They're providing services. So the same thing for capital. It's the flow of services coming from capital. The interesting thing here is that the flow of services coming from the capital, say at the Robert Bourassa Dam, would go down because of the drought, right? So that if the water doesn't go through, then you don't have to turn the turbines aren't as utilized, and therefore productivity in this situation would also decrease. If you're in the media and like to talk about productivity. The other thing is that each of these various inputs, capital, labor, energy, have prices. That's what the price of capital services, price of labor services, blah, blah. So these would be but if that's the total cost, but the total cost here will be slightly different when accountants like to talk about, which is this will be higher than the accounting costs simply because the rate of return to capital is included. Could be board, but it could be something that the shareholders expect when they're giving money to the company through share capital or through some other type of entrepreneurial investment. So all the average costs are the total costs up here divided by the quantity of output. One thing which is I find interesting is that in Quebec, there was, I don't think, but I don't know, if there was, if water was considered a free good from before about 2015. Anyways, thinking on getting environmental concerns of the past decade or so has said, look, you're using a scarce resource, and apparently one which is not sustainable in Quebec at least. There's an environmental and a social cost to using water. The social cost, if you have cheap electricity, and it's very cheap, is that you may encourage households to use this scarce resource inefficiently. They use too much of it. They've been modernizing this, so the current rate of the current rate for water in Quebec, the price of water is, they do it as a percentage, 0.75% of the total revenue generated from the sale of hydroelectric generated and sold and comes from their generators sold in Quebec. Here's the cost. We've always been the total cost, and then we talked about the average cost, so let's skip that. In actual fact, the way it operates is this would be the average accounting cost, which I'm told for Legrand is $50 to $70 per megawatt hour, which seems relatively high to me. That would be 5 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour. And as I showed my diagram, there are other three relatively large generating stations on Legrand. What you do is you can think of these are going to be fairly inexpensive hydropower, and then you get up to wind farm, which is going to be more expensive. A point to be that I could make here is that the price is going to go up per kilowatt hour. If you've got the same capital costs, you've got the same labor costs, you've got the same other costs, purchase costs there. If that's relatively constant, but the amount of water available is going down, then the average cost is for power from Robert Bourassa and the other hydro dams on the La Grande, that's going to go up. So this is this one's looking at Churchill Falls. Back here we had 50 to 70. Now we've got $2.95. So that's going to be per megawatt. So that's going to be 0.295 cents per. I'm going to assume that of the amount of power generated, 90% goes to Quebec. So this would be the average amount of energy, which is 31,050,000 megawatt hours, which are imported by or come from Churchill Falls into Quebec. This next diagram says that here's where the dynamic pricing comes in. The costs are going to be fairly constant on these things, but the price is going to go up and down. This probably isn't the best diagram, but the price is going to go up and down. It'll be higher in the winter and lower in the summer. We'll see that a little bit better when we aren't dealing with set prices, but we're dealing with imported and exported prices in video number 3 rather than 2A. So the actual calculations, what you do here is just you add up all the costs from all the generating to get a grand total cost. Then you divide that by all the power which they generate, so total Q. But the other thing here is that from these generating stations, total costs are relatively fixed because you've got fixed capital and labor costs. It's probably not the case. You've got a dam there, you've got the turbines there, they're not running, but you can't say, okay, now you guys can go off and do something else. You're not needed. Take a month off because it's now March. You can't do that. So the costs are still being incurred, but you're not producing as much electricity, point which we've made before. From this first part, what's the message to get from it? Well, to answer the question, why are electricity costs so low? It's that you're using, because you're using hydro-generated electricity. And just to drill down a little bit on that, and the most productive hydro stations in Quebec are on La Grande Riviere with the Robert Bourassa, really big one. So what you need, if you can get large generating stations, then I'm going to assume that there are economies of scale there. They get more water through. They're going to be lower costs than the really somewhat smaller generating station. But it's hydroelectricity, which is the answer. Okay, so that's it for video 2A. So this is the end of the first part. And so now we'll go on to video 2B to see what role does Churchill Falls play and why does Quebec Hydro need the upgrade, the enlargement to Churchill Falls and the new Gull Island. Thanks for watching.